Hi, my name is Kim Daniels, and I'm with Georgetown University's Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life. Along with our partners at Georgetown's Office of Mission and Ministry, we're happy to be hosting this special Dahlgren dialogue on Pope Francis' new encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, on fraternity and social friendship. In these past months, as a global pandemic, economic crisis, and growing division and hostility have swept the world, Pope Francis has brought the gospel and Catholic social teaching, with its priority for the poor and the marginalized, its focus on solidarity, community, and our interconnectedness, to this pivotal moment. In his extraordinary Urbi et Orbi address delivered last March as the COVID-19 pandemic was well on its way to darkening everyday life around the world, Pope Francis stood alone in St. Peter's Square in the dark and in the rain, and he addressed us all saying, "Why are you afraid? With him on board, there will be no shipwreck." Now Pope Francis has written a remarkable encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, signed in Assisi on Saturday and released just yesterday on the feast of St. Francis of Assisi. And today we're hosting this virtual Dahlgren dialogue on the themes of the new encyclical and Pope Francis' call to recognize that we're all brothers and sisters. In Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis raises up ideas of fraternity, solidarity, and social friendship through a rich discussion of the parable of the Good Samaritan, which also happens to be today's reading. And he explores many themes, holding the vulnerable and marginalized close and putting them first, going out to the margins, resisting an economy of exclusion and the throwaway culture, finding an alternative to destructive populist nationalism, responses to war and violence, and we'll explore all of that today. He asks us to extend fraternity from our own families to a suffering world and to expand friendship from the personal to the political and the global. Fratelli Tutti is a powerful expression of faith in a time of doubt, a call of hope in a time of fear, and a challenge to love in a time of anger and division. We're so grateful to have thousands of you joining us from around the country and the world today for this Dahlgren dialogue. We'll have an opportunity for questions and answers later on, so please send any questions you have to the email you see at the bottom of your screen. And please also share your thoughts on social media using the hashtag Fratelli Tutti and by tagging the initiative at GUCST Public Life on Twitter. So joining me today for this discussion are Cardinal Michael Czerny, the Undersecretary of the Migrants and Refugees section of the Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development. Cardinal Czerny has served in Canada, Latin America, Africa, and Rome. Edith Avila Olea, an immigrant advocate in Chicago, Illinois, who is also a board member of Bread for the World. She is the former Justice and Peace Associate Director for the Catholic Diocese of Joliet, Illinois. Giangravé, the Vatican correspondent for Religion News Service, where she covers Pope Francis and the global Catholic Church. She has worked previously at Crux, Catholic News Service, PBS, and MSNBC News. And Sister Nancy Schreck, a Franciscan sister and the program director of Excel Incorporated. She is a former president of the Leadership Conference of Women Religious and a former vice president and president of the Sisters of St. Francis of Dubuque, Iowa. Now, our partner in these Dahlgren dialogues is Father Mark Bosco, Georgetown's Vice President of Mission and Ministry, and his colleagues. We can't be together at Georgetown's chapel, but we can go there virtually, and I'm happy to welcome Father Bosco to open our discussion with a prayer from Dahlgren Chapel at Georgetown. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It is a pleasure to welcome you to Georgetown's Dahlgren Chapel of the Sacred Heart. This chapel is the spiritual heart of our community. For generations, students, faculty, staff, and alumni have encountered God here in our sacraments, in prayer, and in communal reflection. Inspired by our Catholic and Jesuit heritage, we profess our deep respect and sincere appreciation for all people seeking to grow in faith and knowledge here on campus. We are pleased to collaborate with the Initiative of Catholic Social Thought and Public Life for this special virtual Dahlgren dialogue today. Coming together virtually, we offer this time for prayer, framing this dialogue within a place, within a moment of prayer, to renew our common sense of purpose, our common humanity. So let us bow our heads in prayer. Good and gracious God, we come to you in the midst of a pandemic, anxious about the status of our world, but filled with hope that you are present with us, confident of your faithfulness, certain of your love and guidance in and through the ministry of your church, certain of your grace in the work of your servant, Pope Francis. You call us to be attentive to creation, to care for our common home, to find joy in your gospel, to foster love and solidarity with one another. As we begin this dialogue today, Lord, move our minds and hearts from ignorance to understanding, from isolation to dialogue, from indifference to moral responsibility. Draw us into your friendship, that we might worthily praise you. Draw us into solidarity with one another, that we might foster your kingdom of justice and reconciliation. May we truly be sisters and brothers to one another, disciples of mercy, in the great mission of your Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen.
Thanks so much, Father Bosco. And now let me turn to you, Cardinal Czerny, to get our conversation started. You lead the Migrants and Refugees section of the Dicastery for promoting integral human development, and you're a close collaborator of Pope Francis. Can you help us understand the themes of Fratelli Tutti? Why did Pope Francis choose this time and this topic for his new encyclical?
Oh, thank you for having me here. Let me help us all answer that question. Depending on your age, what was it like to hear Pius XII give his Christmas messages during World War II? Or how were you feeling just before Pope John the 23rd published Pacem in Terris? Or when the economic crisis hit at the end of the 2007 or 8, or just after 9/11? I think you need to recover that feeling in your stomach, in your whole being, to appreciate Fratelli Tutti, because I think Pope Francis feels that we need a message, the world needs a message comparable to what we needed during the Cuban Missile Crisis, or World War II, or 9/11, or the big crash of 2007, 2008. We're on the brink. We need to pull back in a very human, in a very worldwide, and in a very local way. That, I think, is one way of getting into Fratelli Tutti.
It is such a pivotal moment, and I think that all of us are experiencing that right now in so many different ways. I'd like to start out by taking a global look, Cardinal Czerny. I know that when Pope Francis addressed the United Nations earlier this month, he said the international community has two possible paths. On the one side, a solidarity grounded in justice and the attainment of peace and unity within the human family, which is God's plan, he said. And on the other, self-sufficiency and nationalism and protectionism and individualism and isolation. And then he expanded on those themes in this encyclical. How does Fratelli Tutti fit within that global vision? And what does he propose as an alternative to that nationalism and individualism?
I think what Fratelli Tutti does is bring those big questions, the big questions you mentioned and others that we'll be touching later, and brings them home to each one of us. Fratelli Tutti attacks an ideal that we subscribe to, many of us, most of us, without knowing it. And that is that we are self-made, prosperous orphans. We're self-made. We don't recognize God as our creator. We're prosperous. We deserve everything that we consume and have. And we're orphans. We're unconnected. We're free. We're very free. We're totally free. We're actually alone. And although he didn't use the image, I think it helps me to understand what Fratelli Tutti, in a sense, is driving against, so that we can get into what it's helping us all to move towards, which is the truth, which is the opposite of self-made, prosperous orphans.
Sister Nancy, what's your reaction to this? Before we start talking about that, I'd also love to get your perspective on the Franciscan nature of this encyclical. We had a Pope named Francis, journeying to Assisi to sign the encyclical at the tomb of St. Francis, and then he released it on the feast of St. Francis. And obviously you're a Franciscan and have led a Franciscan community. Can you let us know give us the Franciscan nature of this, and also please react to anything Cardinal Czerny said as well?
Thank you, Kim. Many people these days have a loss of hope and are afraid because there's so much collapse. And the dominant culture would tell us just work harder, do more of the same, do more of the same. And what's so delightful for me in this letter is that the Pope Francis really provides us an alternative way of looking at our life, and that something new can emerge in this moment. And really, in the Franciscan tradition, it was exactly the same as Francis's time. There was so much collapse around Francis. Wars in the city of Assisi and the surrounding countryside. It felt like so much was falling apart. Feudalism was falling apart. The economy was falling apart. And what Francis did is not give big speeches. We sometimes wish we had more of him saying how we could really make these changes. But what he simply did is affiliate himself or associate with all those throwaways, as Pope Francis calls them, in the culture. He just moved from his secure setting in the dominant culture to another place. And his being in that other place enabled him to see something really significant. I want to tell just one Franciscan story. Most people would know that Francis had this solidarity with people who were cast to the margins. Well, he didn't get that just all of a sudden. He got that because he would leave his place of comfort, and first he would go toward the lepers, but he would run back to his place of comfort. Then he would go a little further and not just give his clothing, but live a bit among the lepers. And then he would go back. And then finally, and this is his big conversion, he could begin to see the leper as his brother or sister. And that was his radical conversion. And that started him down the path of seeing everything differently. So I think this letter from Pope Francis invites us to that kind of relocation of where our loyalty is and our real commitment to be with those people who are the throwaway people in our culture, in our society at this time. So that's why, after doing other kinds of ministry, I have located myself in rural Mississippi in a community that is poor, so that I can try, by my real life experience of living with people who are poor, hear Pope Francis's words in a way that give me lots of encouragement for my ministry here. So that's.
Well, can you tell us a little bit more about the community you serve and what Pope Francis is saying? We'd love to hear about where you are and who you're serving and how Pope Francis is speaking to those in your community.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is a poor rural community. Most of our population lives well under the poverty line that's located in our country or talked about in our country. We serve in a variety of ways in whatever those people tell us is their need. That was one of my big things I had to learn. You don't come in with the solution, but you come in and hear what the people need. So we do after school learning, we do senior citizen activities, we run a resale store. Mostly we hang out with people and hear their needs. So I was so excited and encouraged by what the Pope said about locating the loyalty of our hearts in those places. And I think once we're in those places, we begin to see the terrible impact on people's lives from the dominant culture, which thinks nationalism and economic security, because the people who suffer most are those folks that work for minimum wage, $7.25 an hour in Mississippi, and who get the fallout of that dominant culture thinking. So Pope Francis gives me a bit of hope and encouragement. Now, we're not a very Catholic part of the country, but his broad sense of Christian following and other religious denominational followings of this new way of being in the world gives me a lot of hope.
That's wonderful. And Claire, I'd love to hear your reaction. We've heard already several themes that are favorites of Pope Francis, both in Fratelli Tutti and throughout his pontificate: resisting the throwaway culture, community, going out to the margins. You've covered Pope Francis, you've covered the church, you've covered the global church. What do you see as Fratelli Tutti's significance and its message, and how does it fit within Pope Francis's leadership during the coronavirus and economic crisis right now, and what's its impact on the global church?
Thank you, Kim. You know, as a reporter, it's this encyclical is a bit of a challenge. Unlike the two previous ones, you can't really boil it down to some juicy quote or attractive headline. This is an encyclical that really is trying to encourage people to read it through and to look at all the things that are within it. And so what makes this difficult for people who don't know Pope Francis, probably this encyclical will be a great introduction to him, to all the things that really he's been building from the moment that he was elected as Supreme Pontiff. For those who know him and have been following him, like myself, there's so many new tidbits of information and things to reflect on, and really an opportunity to delve deep into some of the questions of today's society. He starts out with this really scary feeling of loneliness. He calls it dark clouds coming around the world. I don't think we needed Pope Francis to say that. I think we've all been feeling it. Mm-hmm. Things becoming more difficult in society, whether it be on your job and your everyday life, or what's happening at a global scale. That's a real challenge that everyone is faced with. But what Pope Francis gives us is some tools that we can use to try and address this world. And they stem essentially from this very basic question that can seem kind of naive, and for Catholics like myself, almost repetitive, but who is my neighbor? Is the question that really pushes this whole encyclical forward. And that goes from who is my neighbor in my city? Who's the neighbor in my town? How am I supposed to treat foreigners coming into my country? How am I supposed to treat members of an opposing political party? How are we supposed to have a national global conversation when our media communication and partisan interests and a media that sometimes, I'll admit, doesn't act in a way that perhaps is helping a national dialogue or a dialogue in general? How do we have that? And so fraternity is the question. Mercy, coming close to one another. And it can't be boiled down again to something really simple, but it tries to encompass big movements and a feeling that I think every one of us has.
I took that the centerpiece of the encyclical is a reflection on the Good Samaritan, and that question, who is my neighbor, really resonates throughout it. Edith, I'd love to go to you and have you tell us. You are an advocate, a tireless advocate for immigrants and refugees, and you're a leader in what Pope Francis calls the field hospital of our church, going to the margins, serving the most vulnerable among us. What's your reaction to that, to the encyclical as a whole, and also the idea of who is my neighbor?
Thank you so much for having me and challenging me that question, because it's one that I've been thinking about, not just since the release of this new encyclical, but truly since I started falling in love more and more with my faith, and I started to recognize myself, more than just a daughter in Christ, but someone who is here to be the hands and the feet of Jesus on this earth. And so, I want to answer that, I think, in just two brief parts. And one is, that in a way, I felt like Pope Francis was speaking to me as an immigrant. I'm a dreamer, and what that means here in the U.S. is that I was brought to the U.S. as a child, as a baby, 8 months actually, but I lived here my whole life, and growing up in a mixed status family, you're given perhaps challenges that as a child you don't know how to comprehend. And as an adult, you still don't necessarily know how to comprehend and navigate through the systems that are given to us as immigrants. And in so that regard, right, I was touched because I felt very listened to. And I felt like even though, our church is here and very far away at the Vatican, right, I felt like my pain and our suffering as an immigrant community here in the US isn't going in vain and is being heard. And so for me, it was just a moment of like assurance, right, of God in a way, like saying, I'm here, mija, right? You know, I see you, I hear you. And that for me was a very a powerful voice from the church that tells me to be patient. And then, you know, in the works that we do, serving immigrant communities that are in an era that is very anti-immigrant rhetoric and policies. The encyclical, isn't it, again, just reaches out to those who may feel like they've been forgotten, may feel like they're lonely, and assures them that the suffering that we're feeling as a community is not one isolated, but also is not one that is supposed to be this way, that we can do better and that better times are coming. You know, and so I was challenged also in the call to, you know, how are we going to move from this moment today to have a better tomorrow?
Thanks. That's wonderful, Edith. Cardinal Czerny, I wonder if I might return to you quickly. You know, a lot of people watching won't have had the opportunity to read Fratelli Tutti yet. So I'm wondering if you could give us just sort of a quick walkthrough of it. We've talked about the parable of the Good Samaritan. Could you give us a quick overview of its, you know, substance and themes? And we already have someone asking in particular about the interfaith and ecumenical aspects of it.
Very good. Well, the first chapter is what I was evoking by asking us to remember those moments when we felt all of us were on the brink. Our whole world was on the brink. So that's chapter 1, called Dark Clouds Over a Closed World. And the second, by the way, there are 8 chapters, so so that you know where I am when I say one after the other. The second chapter is the Good Samaritan, and what's so special about it is that while we've always known the Good Samaritan as an example of how we should respond, this time the Good Samaritan shows us how we should see, how we should grasp, how we should understand, how we should feel. In other words, it's a deeper appreciation of the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan isn't just about responding right, it's about seeing right. Finally, it's about being right. And the Good Samaritan was a real brother, and we won't be right unless we're real brothers and sisters. And then there are 2 chapters of what needs to change here, not out there in the world, but here. How we think about our world. It's called Envisaging and Engendering an Open World. So what does it take in me to see a world with its open future, open possibilities? And not only, again, seeing, but chapter 4, a heart open to the whole world. And here one of the beautiful words in chapter 4 is hospitality. I don't think one would have ever thought of the word hospitality as part of the social teaching of the church or as a key concept, but it sums up well how we need to be open if we're going to be a family in a common home. And then there are three applications. One is called, very challengingly, Better Kind of Politics. The second one is on dialogue and friendship in society, so reconciliation. And finally, Paths of Renewed Encounter. How are we dealing with one another when there are conflicts and differences? And all of this culminates then in the 8th chapter, which is that we look to our religions, all the religions, to lead, to exemplify, to mark the way in serving fraternity in our world. That you might say, Pope Francis says, let's get on with what our basic task is, and the details will sort themselves out as we do that. Then he quotes the entire declaration, which he co-signed in Abu Dhabi over a year ago, and finally there are 2 prayers. And so that's that's your way through Fratelli Tutti. But I would say that I wouldn't rush through. I would take my time in chapter 1 and chapter 2. And with that, then you can see where you are, each one of us, each one is called to begin responding.
Because it is a call to each of us how we should respond, right? We're supposed to, my sense is that we read these documents as a way to challenge ourselves and where we personally are. And while I know that, of course, this document is addressed to the church around the world, to people of goodwill around the world, and it focuses on global issues. Here in the United States, I'd love to talk a little bit about its implications for us here, given that, again, like everyone, we've suffered through this pandemic and economic crises. We're also just weeks away from a very divisive election. Sister Nancy, I wonder if we might talk to you about that. What do you think the implications of Fratelli Tutti are for us here in the United States, particularly in this context of our current moment as we approach the election with everything else going on right now? And you might.
One of the things that this document invites us to is that in this time that feels so politically divided, that we would really see each other as a neighbor, a friend. We have to be in relationship. So I think it tries to heal the divide. And here again, I want to just say something from my Franciscan tradition. You know, when Francis went to visit the Sultan, it was in the time of the Crusades, and the dominant attitude is, let's kill the person that doesn't think like we think, right? To dominate them. And Francis simply goes and he tells the brothers who come with him, don't even talk about the sacraments or anything like that. We're just going to listen. That's my loose translation of what he said. We're going to listen. And the Sultan received him. They came away in relationship to each other, and Francis goes back to Assisi and actually incorporates into his life and that of the Franciscan family some simple practices of Islam, like the call to prayer. Okay, so the learning in that is, it's important to be able to go to the person that we perceive as our enemy, or that the dominant culture calls our enemy, and build relationship. And the document affirms that and restates that in, I think, almost every section of the writing.
I agree. I see that throughout. And Claire, I wonder if you might pick up on this a little bit. First of all, I'd love to hear your sense of where, how this is affecting us, how it will affect people in America, what Pope Francis is saying in our particular moment here. But also, I know since you've covered this so much, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the relation with the Joint Declaration on Human Fraternity as well.
Very
Separate
well.
questions.
So, you know, when it comes to the United States, of course, Pope Francis's comments tend to be to the entire Catholic Church. So I think anyone could really find their own personal situation reflected. Most of Italians think that it's all about them, for example. But at the same time, I think there are some topics that really resonate with what is going on in the United States. Some of the things Nancy has already pointed out, but also questions of racism, I think, are extremely important. And of course, everything that he said about immigration. I think another aspect that deserves some attention, without getting into the detail of what it means, once again, for Pope Francis to be speaking strongly about treating migrants with respect, especially at the border, and what significance borders have in today's globalized society. I think it's worth mentioning also Pope Francis really tackling something that is a little bit out of the Pope's comfort zone, you know, talking about economy. How do we make sure that people have jobs? That is a priority. It's an habilitating thing for human beings. How important is it for us to try and make sure that the difference between the very rich and the very poor is not so felt? How can we really make sure that there is a preferential option for the poor? I think in the United States, these feelings are coming out in various different ways. And for anyone reading this encyclical, they couldn't but feel called by that, or somehow that Pope Francis has something very specific to say. And as Edith said before, for migrants, that's true as well. Concerning the interreligious dialogue aspect of this encyclical, which I find absolutely fascinating, You could almost say that this is an encyclical written with four hands. This is Pope Francis and the Grand Imam coming together, and there's a tremendous effort, a kind of bold effort on the part of this encyclical to say, these are the things we have in common. And that doesn't mean that we don't know all the things that make us different and that we have different beliefs on, but we agree on this. We want peace. We are against war. We're against ideological colonization. We're against terrorism. And we're here to stand together. I would also add, I was at the press conference yesterday at the Synod Hall presenting this encyclical, and standing there speaking next to Vatican prelates was a judge. I wish I could remember the name. Probably, Michael, I had it in my notes here, but Mahmoud Abdel Salam was also present. And this is the first time that a Muslim is sitting there speaking on behalf of the encyclical in the Vatican and saying, yeah, we completely back what Pope Francis says. And some of the things he said about the encyclical are kind of invigorating in terms of what this dialogue could really bring and its consequences.
Well, it was very bold. That engagement certainly was part of the boldness. But I also want to return to what you said about economics. I was really struck by the strong language that Pope Francis had for what he called spillover economics. He's also called it the economy of exclusion. And he also strongly reaffirmed the basic Catholic social teaching principle of the universal destination of goods based on the equal dignity of all. So I'd maybe like to ask several of you this question. And Edith, maybe we could start with you. What do you think Pope Francis' vision of economic justice as it affects the people you serve? Like, how was he speaking on those issues to you and your community?
Thank you so much. So I thought this part was extremely powerful because I want to use a specific example and speak to how the pandemic has impacted, the Latino community here in the U.S. and many of those who are undocumented or lack legal status. And so we know that the pandemic has impacted Black and Brown people not just through the virus itself, but also economically, right? They're the ones who have lost jobs and perhaps don't have the security, right? Don't have the security of legal status. And what I mean by that is that many people, right, when they lost their jobs here in the US, when the stimulus package came out from the US Congress, there are thousands that were left out of the stimulus package, meaning that, they had no financial assistance or no access to some of the public benefits that US citizens do receive here in the US. And so Pope Francis did an amazing job at talking about the global economy and how our economy leaves out the most vulnerable people, right? And that it's an injustice to those people to be left behind in not only, in any situation, but perhaps even greater and of an injustice to be left behind in the middle of a pandemic with little to no security net. And I was affirmed by the work that we're doing because, for example, here in Illinois, we were able to help some of these families who were left behind or left out of the packages to help families by giving them state assistance and helping them through perhaps a one-time gift of applying for financial assistance, and we've also seen many food pantries at churches, at nonprofits, communities coming together to raise these goods and to share these goods with those who were left out or have been left out through not just the packages, the stimulus packages, but generally through the pandemic or through the global economy that we have that leaves behind really vulnerable people without any areas or extra ways to get assistance. And so we continue to advocate, right, for those families who not only might they not have, right, the financial means to continue on living with dignity, but then they also lack health insurance. And so he spoke a little bit about, the right to health care in that every individual, right, has some dignity to them, right? Because we're made in the image of God himself. And I think at times when we have such an individualistic society, right, we forget that we belong to each other, and that by belonging to each other, we are responsible to each other, and it can't just happen through prayers. It has to happen through action, and I think he made that really clear in the encyclical, and I think he challenged us all, right. We see the pandemic is not over. And so we still have an opportunity to help.
Well, he did challenge us all. And I think that, one thing that he does, right, is he talks about what happens at the local level, in the particular, what happens at the global and the universal level. And so, Cardinal Czerny, I want to turn to you because you and Edith both serve similar groups of people, right? Edith at the local level and you more at the global level when we talk about migrants and refugees. And so first, I'd love to hear any thoughts you have on Pope Francis' vision of economic justice here in this document. But also, I'd love to hear about how he addresses immigrants and refugees and the building of walls, because he sees that, to my mind, as a real test of faith and justice. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Very good. But before I answer, let me just add to a word about yesterday, just to remind everybody that this conference presenting the encyclical took place in the Synod Hall, and not just in any sort of auditorium. It was the Synod Hall. So you had a theologian from Britain, and then the judge, Judge Abdel Salam, speaking from the same chairs where the cardinals usually sit when they're guiding and directing the synod. And to me, that was a very touching symbolism too. It was a kind of a message to the church also, and and it was a sign. It was an acting out of the 8th chapter of the encyclical, not just encouraging everybody to read it or encouraging everyone to implement it, but actually doing it. And I found that very touching and very, very, very consoling. Regarding the economy, we have to keep reminding ourselves that it's not the role of a church leader, not even of the Pope, to tell us how to run the economy. He's not, and he never will do that, nor will he tell us how to run our politics. That's not the role of any church representative as member of the clergy, but to guide and orient us towards the values. And I think the most important thing that Pope Francis does in Fratelli Tutti is call us to reestablish political control over the economy. The economy is not in the driver's seat. The driver's seat is political. The economy is part of the picture. It can't be at the top of the heap, and it is now. And so that's, for me, the most important thing. Then how it applies in different kinds of economies in different parts of the world, that's up to the people in each country, in each area, to really struggle to work out. But I think the principle of reestablishing the what he calls good politics, a better kind of politics, is extremely, extremely, extremely important. And so that's my takeaway on the economy. I don't know, it's not for me to say that, this measure or that measure is the right measure. That's up to the people to decide through their politicians and with the cooperation of those who are business leaders and others who serve in the economy.
Sister Nancy, I know when we talked, you reminded me that Pope Francis often focused on just what Cardinal Czerny is saying in terms of putting people's faces, putting people at the center of our discussions on the economy, our discussions about politics. So I'd love your reaction to what you think of as Pope Francis' economic vision here. And at the same time, I'd also like your reaction to his discussion of politics. I think he calls us to a better kind of politics. And I'm wondering what that means for you. And then after this, we're going to go to everybody's questions. We have a number of questions coming in, and we're really looking forward to getting to them now. Sister Nancy.
Okay. Well, Kim, I think that the really genius piece of what Francis talks about in terms of the economy is, again, the theme that runs through the whole document. Who's my neighbor? And how do I treat those who are the casticides by an economic system that kind of generates people who are poor. It's to the benefit of some and to the detriment. Our current economic arrangements in so many places in the world are for the benefit of a few and the exclusion or the destruction of the many. So I think what we have to keep doing, I'm going to sound like a broken Franciscan record on this, but we have to keep building bonds of relationship between those who have resources and those who don't. Because I think what the Pope is saying here is it's relationship that changes our thinking. We could have abstract economic principles, but they start to take hold when we see the impact that they have on people. So just a simple example, on our board of Excel, this nonprofit organization in Mississippi, we have some of the wealthiest people we know and some of the poorest people we know. We have people from all different religious denominations and different racial groups, because it's in building relationships with each other that we get things done in our community. My favorite day was when one of the wealthiest women, this was several years ago, on our board said about a poor woman who lives in public housing, "I think you should run for mayor. You'd be the best mayor this city could have." See, and when we all live in our separate worlds, we never get to that kind of place. So the genius of the piece on the economy is about building relationships. And I would say about the political situation, I suppose it's about relationship again. But as Cardinal Czerny said, the politics runs the economy. So we've got to make a difference in the politics. I'm just such an advocate these days of making sure everybody I know votes. Right? And in rural Mississippi, where people died to get the right to vote, it just it infuriates me that someone would not take up that opportunity. So we make political change so there can be economic change, and we do that in relationship with each other.
Well, and that's a good bridge to our first question from our viewers. And Claire, I'm going to send this your way. This person says that the encyclical talks about encounter and also warns that social media offers an illusion of encounter, almost an occasion of sin as we attack and dismiss others. What does Pope Francis say about encounter and kindness, and what does that mean for our actions on social media, including within our church?
This needs a bit of interpretation. But I think I would start from, again, that image of the Urbi et Orbi, that loneliness of Pope Francis under the rain. I think that's probably going to be one of the most powerful symbols of this pontificate going forward. And speaking about how we're all supposed to be feeling so much closer to each other, and yet there is this sort of daunting feeling of loneliness, and how the way that our communication methods are made make us more and more entrenched in our own little groups of interests. This is something that hasn't escaped Pope Francis's attention in any way, shape, or form. And he goes deep into what this means. But he calls us to really, even in this time of pandemic, look for ways to have sincere dialogue with other people. But dialogue sometimes can be misunderstood, Pope Francis warns. It could seem that if we are open to communication with others, then we must all kind of blend into this sort of gray area where we all agree on everything and nothing. But really, the main object of communication, and even on social media, and as a journalist, I would say this relates to fake news, for example, is just seeking the truth. And that's a responsibility that comes from both parts of the people who are talking, who are dialoguing. A responsibility to really try and achieve the truth in our conversations, in our dialogue, be that about politics or be that about the latest interview a journalist did and publishes. Seeking the truth and being willing to stand your ground in what you believe, it's a very delicate balance, but one that Pope Francis is really encouraging us to take on. And again, this isn't an almanac of answers. The encyclical isn't going to really solve all the complex relations of today's modern day communication. Should I tweet? Should I take a pause from social media? These are all questions that we're all faced with, I guess. But he's telling us, if we are guided by the objective and desire to reach the truth, then perhaps some of the partisan interest and some of the strong-held beliefs that we just take for granted can be set aside, and something more exciting and special lies beyond that. I think that relates to many things, and social media and the media included in general.
And That's wonderful, and here's hoping that people take this message to heart. Right, Cardinal Czerny, this is for you, and this is from the refugee camp. Someone is writing us from the refugee camp of Palabek in the north of Uganda with refugees from South Sudan, and they ask. Father Uba asks that we have learned to be the neighbor of others of refugees, and we have to learn. We have much to learn from them as well. They need us, and we need them. And he asks, what does the encyclical say on the refugee issue?
Well, basically what the encyclical applies the title to refugees. It says that refugees are not to be reduced to that category, refugee or asylum seeker or stranger or foreigner or invader or whatever categories one might be tempted to use. But first and finally, they are Fratelli Tutti. We are all brothers and sisters. So, but I think since you're asking from Uganda, I can say that Uganda is an example of an open policy whereby those who seek refuge are welcome, and they're given the chance to not only to be safe, but to settle, to farm, and to live their lives. And one day, hopefully, they'll feel free to go home, or if they're really integrated, they'll stay. But Uganda, with all its own problems, its poverty, has opened its door to over 1 million of its neighbors who need shelter. So your question comes from a place where I think you're already living Fratelli Tutti in an impressive way.
Sister Nancy, I think I'm going to ask you to answer this one. We've had a couple questions on the title of the document, and in particular, the document on solidarity. Is this the appropriate title? Would you tell us a little bit first your reaction to the title and when you read the document, and also I know you had something to add about the Franciscan nature of this as well. Well,
the title was a little disappointing to me, as I know it was for other women. I've been hearing that. People will say, well, he didn't mean any harm by using this title. The Pope has the sense of brothers and sisters of all to each other. But actually, the quotation comes from Francis literally speaking to his brothers, an admonition to the brothers who were the Franciscan friars. So that creates a little problem for us. And what women have to do is what we've always had to do, is kind of a double duty of dealing with that masculine image. I'm afraid some women might not even read it because they get turned off by the title. So I wouldn't want, I think what we have to be clear is that when Francis says this, he is talking to the brothers. There would be many other images, and the one he uses most in the admonitions are to call each other servants of one another. So that could be a little stronger title for me. In almost every place else where he talks, and he writes often to the people in general, he talks about men and women, or he talks about brothers and sisters. So Francis is kind of clear who he's addressing in this particular admonition, and it was his brothers. So it's probably a little bit of a difficult title for us and in the Franciscan family, knowing that was to the friars. Having said all of that, I wouldn't want the title to get in the way of the massively profound message of the letter, right? So I might prefer something more along the lines of solidarity with one another, that piece a little bit more. So yeah, it's another one of those problems we have with language that doesn't always say what we want it to say, especially when we translate it into many different languages. So I'm going to try not to let the title get in the way, but go to the essence of the meaning of we are brothers and sisters, literally, to those who are near us and to those who are in Uganda or Honduras or any place else in the world, that we can take in our time that thought of really being brothers and sisters to all. Francis did that over and over again. I think it's Murray Bodo who had a line in one of his books about St. Francis. He said, Francis could walk among all, be they beggars or governors or the Pope himself, as if they were kings. Again, it was in the masculine language, but that sense of being able to treat all people with this very deep respect is what I think is the essence of the title, even though the masculine way is a little problematic for folks. So maybe we'll just leave it at that. Women have overcome these hurdles many, many times in our history. And in the Franciscan family, we struggle with the same thing because he talks about fraternity so often. And we can't find a better word because community doesn't quite say it. It's not quite as radical as really looking into the eyes of others and seeing brothers and sisters.
Thank you for that. And now we have a question from Bishop Tyson, and it speaks to just what you're talking about in terms of being brothers and sisters of all, of everybody, even when we disagree, even if there's a lot of hostility. And I might go to you with this, Cardinal Czerny. Bishop Tyson says, how do we build bridges to those who are not open to these messages? What's the difference between reaching out and at some point banging the dust off our sandals and moving on? What are the best practices for welcoming immigrant communities and others?
Well, I think it's recognizing the difference between responding, first of all, seeing a person, people, as brother and sister, as opposed to the policies or the practices or the regulations which treat them in certain ways, which often are dehumanizing and distancing. And so you can't, it's not a question of getting beyond being brothers and sisters because people have come from somewhere else, but it is treating them with that loving regard that that is our nature, that is our reality, and then working hard and struggling to realign or reshape, reform the policies and procedures and ways of dealing with problems that we have in society, in the economy, in communications, even in the life of the church. So not to be distracted by the issues from recognizing the brother or sister. That's how I would boil it down, I guess.
Thanks very much for that. And Edith, I'd love to ask this question of you. Someone asks how this document, which not everybody will have a chance to read, gets out to the people in the pews, the people who will be most affected by this message. How do you think this will get communicated to your community, to the people you serve, to other young people?
That's an important question, and one that spending 7 years as working in the diocese. Previously, we always asked ourselves, this is like the golden ticket kind of question. How do you get this to the everyday person? And I really think it comes down to creating moments of encounter with each other. And I think that we've all alluded to this to some degree, right? But ultimately, a person will not recognize their neighbor if they're not able to speak to their neighbor or see their neighbor. And I want to just give a little example, right? When one of my jobs at the diocese was to work with a group of young adults. And these were young adults, right, who had their families and were busy being attorneys, teachers, campus ministers, et cetera. And every month for 3 years, every single month, we would go and serve at our local food pantry in Joliet, Illinois. And over the years, I got to know the clients. And I went from seeing them as, right, like our homeless clients who were part of the community, to knowing their stories, to knowing their names, to knowing what foods they liked, right? And that opportunity of encounter only happened because there was an invitation, right? An invitation to come in. And I think so often, similar to the story, right? The Samaritan story that Pope Francis speaks to in the encyclical, right? So easy it is to walk the other way, right? Or to take the different path, to avoid that person, whether it be an immigrant, a refugee, a homeless person. And it's our right, our Christian duty to perhaps not take the other route, to take what's more challenging, what makes us maybe uncomfortable, and hear their story. Because the matter of fact is, right, that it can be any one of us, right? Pope Francis has often asked in different instances, why was it, I'll never understand why it was you and not me, right? And I remember when I first heard that, I think I was still in college, my undergraduate degree, and it stuck with me because I realized that the reason that I am where I am is purely because of the grace that God has given me. And therefore I have the responsibility as a Christian, right, to care for my brothers and sisters. And so I think we need to move beyond seeing the immigrant as the immigrant or the refugee as the refugee. And we need to see them as brothers and sisters. Because when we can see them as a brother and sister, right, as you would your own sister if you have one, or I have 4 sisters and a little brother who's not so little. He's 19 years old, but he's still my little brother. And, if something were to happen to them, it would hurt me. And I think that's the call, right? We need to, Pope Francis is asking us to feel our neighbors hurt and to feel their pain. Because in feeling that, we will hear the call, right? We will hear their cry, and I think we'll be moved into action, but we won't hear them if we're walking the other way.
And that's one of the central challenges, right, is to be that neighbor for people. I hope it's okay with you all. We're going to go a few minutes late just because we're having so many great questions come in. Not too long, but just 5 or so more minutes, if that's all right. We have several questions on Laudato Si coming in. And Claire, I might throw this one to you. How Laudato Si relates to this? What kind of themes are picked up in Fratelli Tutti that were in Laudato Si, and how you see that relationship?
Well, of course, there are numerous mentions in the latest encyclical Fratelli Tutti about how we behave in our country, even in terms of the environment, can have global repercussions. That is something that is repeated. There are many parts of Laudato Si that he kind of reiterates and puts an emphasis on. I think also when it comes to cooperation between nations, those are some of the themes that he got from Laudato Si. This is an encyclical that comes out 5 years later. So it really, you can see there's a bridge, a sort of connection between the thoughts, but you can also see how from certain reflections that Pope Francis was having in the past, how they've matured and grown. I think there's so many interesting aspects of it. I would stop on one for just 1 minute. He pays attention to the specific experience of indigenous peoples, which is something that obviously had great importance when he was writing Laudato Si. And he says something that he said during the Summit of Bishops, the Synod at the Vatican, on this very same topic, that perhaps they also propose a model of how we can relate to each other, where we can conserve our culture while at the same time being open and not just repeating the same things over and over again in some closed cycle. To me, this is one of the most suggestive and interesting parts of the encyclical. Cardinal Czerny, of course, was mentioning it before, but on one side, we've got this Tower of Babel, and there's this uniformity, one culture kind of dominating over in this ambitious plan to reach for the skies. And on the other hand, we've got these closed alcoves that we're just scared with what's happening around the world, refuse to engage in dialogue with people who are perceived as different, and they go into those vicious cycles of repeating and without ever really reaching what Pope Francis says is the third way, which is a synthesis. It's another option where we can keep, I call it the Wakanda way. We can keep what we have that makes us unique in our culture and our experiences, but without being afraid to engage with others. And that kind of conversation through dialogue breached in truth can really bring this new kind of plan that Pope Francis is outlining very boldly, again, I'll repeat, in this encyclical. So to me, that's the kind of interesting aspect.
Well, let me take that to you, Cardinal Czerny. And also we have a couple of questions, and I'm going to combine them, that ask how Fratelli Tutti builds on the tradition of Catholic social teaching, what it has to say about solidarity in particular, and then maybe also just general Catholic social teaching principles, talk a little bit about just war, which is one of the ways in which Pope Francis maybe carries forward.
That's right. The encyclical is steeped in the tradition of Catholic social teaching, and but it's I think to look at the particular principles is not so much the point here. It's perhaps the most brilliant pastoral application of Catholic social teaching that we have, the most comprehensive and in a sense the deepest attempt that the Church has made, not only to teach the Christian implications of the gospel for how we live together in society, how we live together in community and in the world, not only the implications, but a way of doing it. And that's what pastoral means. Pastoral means applying and living the gospel and helping each other to live the gospel. So we don't go to Fratelli Tutti for important developments of doctrine. We go to it for how to live. And since this might be my last chance to speak, I just want to show you the edition of the Osservatory Romano that everybody in St. Peter's Square received as a gift, a personal gift from the Pope. So it was a gesture of saying, I want to give this encyclical to each and every one. So this is the Pope in the midst of young Fratelli Tutti in Thailand, I think. And this is a lovely greeting from him on the front cover, so that everyone can feel that this is not just words on paper, but it is really a gift from the Holy Father to each one of us, and indeed a gift of God to all of humanity.
Thank you for that. And maybe I'll do one more quick question around to each one of you. You're a cardinal at the Vatican. You are a Franciscan sister working in Mississippi. You were a dreamer in Chicago, and you were a Vatican correspondent. And maybe I'll start with you, Claire. What is Francis saying to you? What is he saying to us? And how can people listening to this discussion act on what we've heard today?
I'm so glad you asked me this question. I'll say this. So when I was reading the encyclical, of course, I was thinking of all the work I had to do and write up an article and follow up on press conferences, but I couldn't help but get kind of excited reading it. I think as a journalist, you kind of move on through life and you tend to become a little bit cynical. You learn more, and that can make you kind of lose hope to some of the ambitious dreams that you had as a kid. When I was in university, about what kind of world Catholics, but everyone and from every religion in the world could build together. I remember conversations in cafes with people of my age talking about borders and property and the right of every individual human beings, and how religions could come together, and how we could have really a dialogue and really a politics that reflected the interests of the most vulnerable, the poor, our mothers and fathers and cousins and everyone that we know, and especially in this time are going through challenging and difficult times. So for me, it was just fun to feel something that Pope Francis has said over and over again, and I never really got. He would say, the old people dream and the young people do. And I never got that, because the old people that I knew weren't really dreaming that much. They seemed to me too busy in reminiscing or thinking about a time that was gone. But Pope Francis dreamt in this encyclical. And it kind of made me as a young person, and I think many other young people who I believe this encyclical is specifically targeted to, feel inspired and maybe naive, but excited about things not having to be this way in the world.
I love that. And Edith, maybe that's a good way to go right to you. What was your reaction as a young person? And also what can people do? What can they take away from this? How can they act in response to what Pope Francis has said?
Thank you. And, I want to say that there were bits and pieces where I felt uncomfortable because he called out, I think sometimes what we try to avoid in our conversations at parishes, right? We try to stay nice, right? And so in staying nice to each other, we avoid what's happening in the outside walls of the church. And so I was personally, in those instances when I was made uncomfortable and in a way challenged, I wanted to, I invited myself to sit with that uncomfortableness, because often times in my work, as an immigrant, I'm in a unique place because I can't walk away from the hardship. I don't get to just clock in and clock out. I live with it. I live with the uncertainty. I live with, the constant anti-immigrant rhetoric that we hear in the news and on social media. And I live with the nightmares that I get, right, and from that constant drama in the background. And so I don't get the opportunity to walk away. And so as an immigrant, it was an invitation to rest and an invitation to continue with hope, right? Remembering that the cross is extremely hard, but that there is a resurrection. And so I was really grateful for that glimpse of air that it felt like to me, because it's in the current moment, it has felt very, as an immigrant, I have felt suffocated, right? And overwhelmed too many times. And as a Catholic, I felt challenged. Because I want others to be able to feel rest. And so I think that's the call, right, from this encyclical, is to really think, how can I contribute to society to make it better?
Wonderful. Sister Nancy, can you help us? What do you take away from this, and how do you think people can act in response? Sister, your mute button, sorry.
Sorry. My response is very brief. I just felt such an affirmation of really the direction of my life and what I feel committed to. So it was a great encouragement to me to keep going further and deeper so that we might create little, even if it's not changing the whole world, changing where we are, creating imaginal cells of a different way of looking at life. So thank Pope Francis for that.
Wonderful. Cardinal Czerny, we've heard of the encouragement that this offers. We've heard of the challenge. We've heard of the inspiration. What did you take away? If you could just say it in a sentence, and how do you think people should act in response?
Well, if I'm limited to one sentence, I'll quote something I learned on social media, because it helps me to see the direction. If Laudato Si taught us that everything is connected, Fratelli Tutti teaches us that everyone is connected. And if everyone takes responsibility for our common home and for our brothers and sisters, then I think we do have a good chance. And my hope is rekindled, and I'm inspired to keep on going and to trying to do more.
Thank you. That's wonderful. Sister Nancy, would you mind closing us out with a prayer?
So let all of us, wherever we are in the world, from Uganda to Mississippi to Washington to Chicago, we join our spirits because we are people who long for the vision put forth in this letter. We pray. Loving God, we thank you for this time to explore and to celebrate our call to love one another. Grant us the courage to act with the boldness that these words require of us. Gracious God, in these times of great challenge, may we recognize in the eyes of each person the reality of a sister or brother. Faithful God, move our hearts today to locate these hearts, and our efforts, and our loyalty with those who are most on the margins of society. And may the Spirit of Christ and that spirit of all the great religious leaders of our many traditions guide our endeavors and strengthen us for this great work. We pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Sister Nancy, and thanks to you all for joining us for our first online Dahlgren Dialogue. Over 3,000 of you have been on for this, and many more will follow, watch it in its recorded version. And so that's just a reminder that this discussion will be recorded and posted on our website and our social media channels for later viewing as well. We'll also have follow-up resources available from the discussion at our site too, including my colleague John Carr's summary and 12 themes of the encyclical. I also want to let you know very briefly about our upcoming dialogues. On Tuesday, October 13th, the initiative will co-host an online Salt and Light gathering for young leaders under 40 with the Archdiocese of Washington on religion and race, the future of anti-racism in the Catholic Church, with 4 outstanding Black leaders in the U.S. Catholic Church. On October 20th, we'll hold a timely online public discussion on faithful citizenship in the 2020 presidential election as part of our series on faith and the faithful in the U.S. politics with Emma Green of The Atlantic, grassroots organizer Edith Avila, and the initiative's own John Carr. And October 27th, we'll hold an online public dialogue on the moral and public obligations of political winners and losers in elections. I want to thank my friends and colleagues, John Carr and Anna Misla, and our colleagues, Father Mark Bosco and John Crowley-Buck of the Office of Mission and Ministry for everything they did to bring this together here at Georgetown. And we're especially grateful to everyone who helped us on the technical end of things, including our partners at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, Optimum Audio, and AI Media. And finally, thanks to our panel, Cardinal Michael Czerny, Edith Avila Olea, Claire Giangravé, and Nancy Schreck. This has been an outstanding dialogue, and we're so grateful for your contributions. So thank you so much for joining us, everybody.